Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army.
Thank you so much for having me.
So glad you're here. To kick off our deep dive today, I want to start with a quote from the poet W.H. Auden. It's a rather stinging, brilliant observation about the social fabric of Victorian England.
Oh, the backdoor quote.
Exactly. Auden said that among the English middle and upper classes, it might be considered eccentric to be a Catholic, but it was just something that happened in the best families.
Right.
But for an Anglican to become a Baptist, unthinkable. He wrote, Baptists were persons who came to the back door, not the front.
It's just a perfectly striking image. I mean, it encapsulates the intense, almost suffocating social stratification of that entire era.
It really does.
Because in the 19th century, religion wasn't merely a matter of private belief. It wasn't just what you did on a Sunday morning. It was your zip code. It was your social currency. It dictated your literal place in the architecture of British society. You belonged at the front door, or you belonged at the back door. The lines were drawn in stone.
And that image, that front door versus back door dynamic, is the perfect threshold for us to cross today. Because we are looking at a man who was born not just with the right to use the front door, but who essentially owned the entire estate.
Absolutely.
We are talking about the Honorable and Reverend Baptist Wriothesley Noel.
A fascinating figure.
And the mission for this deep dive, for you listening right now, is to trace the astonishing trajectory of this man. He was born to the absolute highest echelons of British aristocratic society, and he willingly forfeited his power, his prestige, and what was almost certainly a guaranteed track to a bishopric.
Right, and he gave it all up.
All for a matter of deep conscience. And in the process of dismantling his own privilege, he laid the very groundwork for modern city missions and what would eventually become the Salvation Army.
It's an incredible story. And to map out this journey, we're relying on a phenomenally detailed piece of historical analysis from the Baptist Quarterly.
Published back in 1972.
Yes, exactly, by D. Bebbington. And we're also pulling in some crucial historical context regarding a contemporary of his, the Victorian builder and Baptist, Samuel Morton Pineau.
Pineau is such an interesting side character in all this.
He really is. Between these sources, we get a window into a world where theology and high-stakes social reform just collided violently.
So let's start by establishing the sheer altitude of Noel's starting position. Because to understand the weight of his sacrifice later on, we have to understand the staggering heights from which he stepped down.
Right, the baseline of his privilege.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He was born in 1798 into the Noel family, the Earls of Gainsborough. His mother was Baroness Barham. I mean, we aren't just talking about a comfortable upper-middle-class upbringing here.
Not at all. This was mind-boggling systemic privilege. That really cannot be overstated.
What did that actually look like for them?
Well, the Noels possessed hereditary rights to legislative power. We are talking about guaranteed seats in Parliament.
Just handed to them.
Yes. His father served as a member of Parliament for Rutland for nearly 50 years. He practically owned the representation of the county.
That's wild.
And Lord Lieutenancies, which were the monarch's personal representatives in each county, they were just passed around his family like inherited pocket watches.
So they had the political power locked down. What about the money?
Their wealth was vast, ancient, and deeply tied to the land. To give you a concrete historical figure from the research, in the year 1840 alone, Noel spent over £2,100 simply on the upkeep of two of his households.
Wait, £2,100? Let's put some meat on those bones to give that number scale.
Please do.
Because in the 1840s, a highly skilled, highly sought-after tradesman working tirelessly in London might bring home roughly 50 to 70 pounds in an entire year.
Exactly.
So Noel was casually dropping the equivalent of dozens of middle-class annual salaries just to keep the fires burning, the horses fed, and the domestic staff paid.
In just two of his residences. The man was insulated by a fortress of wealth.
Utterly insulated. And his initial career trajectory reflected exactly what you would expect from a son of that environment. He was originally sent to train for the law.
At the Middle Temple, yes.
Right. And the Middle Temple is one of the 4 Inns of Court, these exclusive institutions entitled to call their members to the English bar.
It was the premier training ground for the nation's elite.
It was designed to groom young aristocrats for high judicial office or prominent political careers. But then a shift happens.
A major shift. He was heavily influenced by his mother's profound personal piety, and also the example set by his older brothers, who had already taken clerical orders. So he decides to pivot. He enters the Anglican ministry in 1823.
Now, I found the family's reaction to this so revealing in the source material. They actually opposed his ordination.
They really did.
Yeah.
Which seems counterintuitive to us.
Right. You would assume that becoming a clergyman in the Church of England, the state-sponsored, established religion, would be a perfectly respectable path for an aristocratic son. I mean, it's not like he was running off to join a circus.
He was respectable, certainly, but his family was playing a different game.
How so?
They likely viewed his immense potential for secular power, like rising through politics or the upper echelons of the judiciary, as the proper utilization of his pedigree.
So a church job wasn't prestigious enough.
Well, a parish priesthood, even a high-profile one, was arguably a step down from the geopolitical influence a Noel was expected to wield.
Interesting. But he pursues ordination anyway.
He does. And he certainly doesn't fade into the background of a sleepy rural parish. He very quickly ascends to become the minister of St. John's, Bedford Row, in Holborn.
And St. John's was not your run-of-the-mill neighborhood parish church, was it?
Far from it. St. John's was a proprietary chapel.
Which means what, exactly?
It means it was somewhat independent of normal parish structures. But more significantly, it was the absolute nerve center of the evangelical party in London.
The nerve center?
If you were anyone in the evangelical movement, you were at St. John's. The congregation was packed with luminaries.
People like William Wilberforce, right?
Yes, the legendary driving force behind the abolition of the slave trade, and Zachary Macaulay, another prominent abolitionist. It was the epicenter of moral, social, and spiritual reform in the British capital.
That is quite the room to preach to. And that brings us to a conceptual cornerstone in the source material, something that deeply defined London evangelicalism in the 1820s.
The Catholic Christianity concept.
Yes, this driving philosophy called Catholic Christianity. And we really need to pause and draw a massive bright line under this for clarity.
It's crucial we define this.
When we use the word Catholic in the specific context of 1820s London evangelicalism, we absolutely do not mean Roman Catholic.
Not at all.
We're using Catholic with a lowercase c, meaning universal, all-embracing, broad, and unified.
That distinction is paramount. This lowercase v Catholic Christianity marked an incredibly beautiful, surprisingly cooperative window of time.
What did that cooperation actually look like on the ground?
It was an era where Anglicans, Independents, Wesleyans, Congregationalists, and Baptists actively chose to cooperate.
They just worked together.
They consciously set aside their denominational badges. They dropped their arguments over church governance, their theological squabbles, to focus on a shared mission.
Spreading the gospel.
Exactly. And this spirit birthed massive interdenominational powerhouses, organizations like the London Missionary Society and the Religious Tract Society.
You know, thinking about how unprecedented that level of cooperation was, an analogy from the tech world seems to fit perfectly here for our listeners.
I like this. Let's hear it.
It's highly reminiscent of modern open source software development.
Okay, yes.
Imagine massive tech giants, companies that are usually fierce corporate rivals, constantly fighting over patents and market share. Suddenly, they realize that to build something truly revolutionary, they need to collaborate on a shared core code, like Linux.
Right, because a robust foundation helps everyone.
Exactly. They recognize that a foundational operating system benefits everyone. So in the 1820s, these different religious denominations were acting exactly like those tech companies.
That's a great way to put it.
They agreed to ignore their corporate rivalries, their specific denominational labels, to collectively build and defend the core code, which to them was the Orthodox evangelical gospel.
That captures the dynamic beautifully. The core code was the shared belief in conversion, scripture, and evangelism. As long as you subscribe to that foundational operating system.
But the specific user interface you preferred didn't matter.
Precisely. Whether that meant baptizing infants or adults, whether you submitted to the authority of bishops or preferred local congregational voting, it was treated as entirely secondary.
And Noel was fully on board with this open source model.
Oh, he thrived in this intellectual and spiritual ecosystem. He became its ultimate champion. He firmly articulated that churchmen and Orthodox dissenters should be, in his own words, one in profession, in action, and in heart.
And he wasn't just writing polite letters about this, right? He was the superstar of the movement.
He really was. He was speaking at Exeter Hall to massive, overflowing crowds, publishing widely read pamphlets, corresponding with religious and political leaders all over the European continent.
So this open source collaborative spirit sounded brilliant in theory, and it worked flawlessly in the grand, high-ceiling meeting halls.
Yes.
But here is where the narrative pivots. Because Noel wasn't satisfied with theory.
Not at all.
When he tried to take that collaborative, open-source spirit out of Exeter Hall and apply it to the actual gritty, disease-ridden streets of London, he slammed headfirst into an institutional brick wall.
Because Noel was, at his core, obsessed with action over theological posturing.
He couldn't just preach to the wealthy reformers and call it a day.
Exactly. He couldn't just preach to the comfortable folks at St. John's and feel his duty was done. He was profoundly distressed by the staggering poverty and spiritual destitution of London's rapidly expanding lower classes.
The Industrial Revolution was really taking a toll.
It was packing people into slums at an unprecedented rate, and the traditional church structures were utterly failing to keep up.
So what does he do?
Well, in 1835, Noel takes a highly public step. He publishes an open letter addressed directly to the Bishop of London, Charles James Blomefield.
And what's in the letter?
In this letter, he lays out the stark, terrifying reality of the city's destitution and effectively demands immediate radical action.
And that letter served as the spark that ignited a whole new movement.
It really did.
Because of the pressure and the vision outlined in that document, Noel partnered with a fiercely pragmatic Scottish visionary named David Naismith.
Naismith is a great figure in this history.
Together, they directly catalyzed the founding of the London City Mission, and Noel didn't just lend his name to it.
No, he was hands-on.
He chaired the mission's very first public meeting, giving it the stamp of his aristocratic and clerical authority. He also threw his weight behind the Ragged School movement,
Which was incredibly important work.
dedicated to providing free, basic education and daily care to destitute, often orphaned children in the slums.
And, to a modern observer, organizing a mission to feed the poor, educate destitute children, and provide spiritual comfort seems like the most uncontroversial thing a clergyman could possibly do.
Right. You see a desperate human need, you pool your resources, and you intervene.
But in the 1830s, the Anglican establishment reacted as if Noel was organizing a violent insurrection.
The backlash was astonishingly bitter. Publications like The Record, which served as the popular biweekly paper for conservative Anglican evangelicals, launched a relentless campaign against the London City Mission.
They were brutal.
They accused it of being a subversive, dangerous, dissenting society, which, to modern ears, calling a charity a dissenting society, sounds like bizarrely polite bureaucratic jargon.
It does sound mild today.
So what was the actual threat? Why were they so furious?
The fury stemmed from two massive structural violations that struck at the heart of how the Church of England maintained its authority.
Okay, what's the first violation?
First, the London City Mission utilized lay workers.
Meaning everyday people.
Exactly. Unordained everyday people, shoemakers, clerks, bakers. They were paid a small stipend to go into the slums, read the Bible, and provide social care.
And the church didn't like that.
The Church of England vehemently maintained that this kind of spiritual and pastoral work was the exclusive, licensed prerogative of ordained clergy.
Wow. Okay, and the second violation?
Second, these mission workers completely ignored traditional parish boundaries. A parish priest was supposed to have total spiritual jurisdiction over a specific geographical area. But the London City Mission workers just walked right past those invisible lines, going wherever the poverty was worst.
Crossing jurisdictions without asking permission.
Exactly.
So underneath the theological jargon, it's turf war.
Yes.
It's about protecting the monopoly.
It is fundamentally a turf war about authority and jurisdiction. But the establishment framed it entirely in theological terms. What we are seeing is the timeless tension between the mission of the church and the order of the church.
Mission versus order.
Right. Men like Bishop Blomefield and Samuel Wilberforce, who was the son of Noel's friend William Wilberforce, and who would soon become a powerful bishop himself, they prioritized order above almost everything else.
Why were they so obsessed with order?
They genuinely believed that a highly structured, state-sanctioned, tightly regulated church hierarchy was the only barrier keeping the nation from descending into anarchy and religious radicalism.
There is a chilling quote in the source material that perfectly captures this mindset.
I think I know the one you mean.
Samuel Wilberforce writes a letter to Noel criticizing his involvement with the mission, and he says, "That which seems to you the narrowness of bigotry, I esteem the will of the God of order."
It is a devastatingly polite way of saying your unauthorized collaboration with outsiders is a threat to the divine system. Wilberforce and Blomfield looked at Noel's fraternizing with non-Anglicans, his empowering of uneducated lay people to do pastoral work, and his disregard for parish lines, and they saw chaos. They saw indiscipline.
Because to their minds, God is fundamentally a God of order.
Exactly. And the Church of England, with its bishops and parishes, is the physical manifestation of that divine order on earth. Therefore, to bypass the parish system, to bypass the ordained priesthood, was to rebel against God's structure.
This is such a critical point because it connects directly to you, the listener, today.
Absolutely.
If you have ever volunteered at an urban rescue mission, a modern food bank, or a disaster relief organization, you are walking into a blueprint that Noel literally had to fight the religious establishment to create.
It's the exact same debate.
The tension you see today between highly trained, licensed social workers and passionate grassroots volunteers, that friction over who is qualified to help the marginalized, that is the exact same turf war Noel was fighting in the 1830s.
And Noel was making the radical argument that the urgency of the human crisis in the slums supersedes the bureaucratic red tape of the institution.
But making that argument eroded his standing with the hierarchy incredibly fast, didn't it?
Oh, incredibly fast. He was elevating the pragmatic, immediate needs of the destitute over the theoretical purity and control of the establishment. And history shows us consistently that when a high-ranking insider starts prioritizing the marginalized over the preservation of the institution pushes back.
With tremendous force.
Always.
And Noel was not a man to back down. In fact, his willingness to cross religious boundaries to help the poor soon translated into a willingness to cross political boundaries.
Yes, he broadens the fight.
If he wasn't intimidated by the Bishop of London, he certainly wasn't going to be intimidated by the Tory political establishment. This is the era where he transforms from a theological nuisance into a genuinely dangerous political figure to the status quo.
Right, because until this point, the prevailing wisdom among the Catholic Christianity evangelicals was to strictly avoid politics.
Keep your head down.
The logic was self-preservation. You didn't want the government to suspect that your interdenominational religious meetings were actually a front for political radicalism or class warfare.
But Noel couldn't compartmentalize like that.
He couldn't. His family was historically tied to the Whigs, which was the more progressive, reform-minded political party. And his own theology convinced him that it was deeply hypocritical to care about a person's eternal soul while ignoring the fact that they were starving to death in the present.
That conviction led to a political bombshell in 1841. He publishes a widely circulated, blistering pamphlet attacking the Corn Laws.
Yes, framing his argument as a moral plea for the poor.
Now, to understand why this was so explosive, we have to grasp what the Corn Laws were. As a reminder, we're simply reporting the history here, not taking sides on 19th-century trade policies.
Of course.
But historically speaking, these were massive government-enforced tariffs and trade restrictions on imported food and grain. They were specifically designed by Parliament to keep domestic grain prices artificially high.
And who does that benefit?
Right. It protects the massive profits of the rich, land-owning aristocratic class who controlled British agriculture.
Which is, ironically, the exact social class that Noel and his family belonged to.
Precisely. He is engaging in a massive betrayal of his own class interests. Because the Corn Laws kept the price of bread artificially high, the urban poor literally could not afford to eat. Malnutrition was rampant.
It was a crisis.
Noel's pamphlet wasn't just a disagreement on economic theory. It was a moral indictment of a political policy that starved the working class to line the pockets of the wealthy.
And the conservative Tory party reacted with absolute fury.
How bad was the blowback?
The sources describe them raining batteries of abuse down on him. Even his own wealthy, comfortable congregation at St. John's began to shrink because the elites were so deeply offended by his entry into radical politics.
So he was systematically dismantling his own support networks.
He was. And he didn't stop with domestic grain economics.
What else did he tackle?
He had already waded into the deeply controversial issue of the Irish poor in 1836, reporting on their horrific conditions. In 1840, he published a scathing report on the dire state of elementary education.
Demanding government intervention, right?
Yes, insisting that the government had a moral obligation to step in and fund schools for the masses. He was weaponizing his religious platform to demand systemic, structural political change.
So the political foundation is cracking beneath him, but simultaneously, the theological foundation of his Anglicanism is beginning to fracture as well. And this brings us to the rise of the Tractarians.
Better known as the Oxford movement.
Right. What was the Oxford movement?
The Oxford movement was a powerful, highly intellectual movement within the Church of England, led by men at Oxford University. They wanted to pull the Anglican Church back toward its older, more Catholic traditions.
Meaning more ritual.
Exactly. They wanted to re-emphasize the authority of the priesthood, the importance of solemn ritual, and the mystical power of the sacraments.
And there was one specific doctrine that really set Noel off, wasn't there?
Yes, one of their absolute core doctrines was baptismal regeneration. This is the theological belief that the physical act of water baptism, when performed correctly by an ordained priest, literally, spiritually regenerates an infant.
Washing away original sin and saving them.
Correct.
Now, Noel was a staunch evangelical. He believed that salvation came through a personal, conscious experience of faith and conversion, not through a mechanical ritual performed on a baby. So he absolutely despised this doctrine.
He really did.
He went on the offensive, publishing a tract stating quite plainly that few serious persons now believe in baptismal regeneration.
Which sounds mild.
Right. That might sound like a mild academic critique, but it drew immediate official censure from Bishop Blomfield.
Blomfield censured him because Noel had made a massive tactical error.
What was the error?
Blomfield correctly pointed out that the official foundational liturgy of the Church of England, the Book of Common Prayer, which every Anglican priest vows to uphold, actually does teach a form of baptismal regeneration in its baptismal service.
Oh, wow. So Noel stepped right into a trap of his own making.
Exactly. By denying the doctrine so forcefully and publicly, Noel wasn't just swatting away a fringe movement from Oxford. He was pulling at a foundational thread that threatened to unravel his own legal and moral right to serve as an Anglican priest.
Because how can you read a service out of the prayer book if you publicly claim the theology in that book is false?
You can't. Not with a clear conscience.
The pressure cooker is reaching a critical point. He has alienated the political conservatives, he's frustrating the church hierarchy with his city missions, and now he is publicly clashing with the foundational liturgy of his own church.
The walls are closing in.
But the external catalysts that finally force him to make a catastrophic break with his past are two massive historical events happening outside of London.
The Scottish disruption and the Maynooth question.
Let's look at the disruption first. This is 1843.
Right. In 1843, the religious landscape of Scotland was torn apart. Dr. Thomas Chalmers, an incredibly respected theologian, led a massive walkout of evangelical ministers from the state-sponsored Church of Scotland.
They just walked away.
They gave up their churches, their salaries, and their homes to form the Free Church.
What was the breaking point for them?
It was state interference. Wealthy landowners, who had the legal rights of patronage, were forcing local congregations to accept specific ministers, regardless of whether the congregation actually wanted them or believed they were spiritually fit.
So the state was dictating local leadership?
Exactly. Chalmers and his followers argued that the state and secular landowners had no right whatsoever to dictate the spiritual governance of Christ's church.
And Noel was watching all this from London?
Noel watched this mass sacrifice happen and expressed unprecedented public sympathy for the seceders. He agreed that a true church must be free to obey Christ, not the dictates of the secular state.
That Scottish walkout primed the pump. But it's the Maynooth question in 1845 that acts as the final intellectual detonator.
This is the massive turning point.
This is the shift that changes Noel's entire life, and the logic behind it is fascinating. How does a government grant to a college in Ireland push an aristocratic London priest out of the Church of England?
It requires tracing a very rigorous logical progression. Let's break it down.
Okay, let's trace it. What is Maynooth?
Maynooth was a Roman Catholic seminary in Ireland training Catholic priests. The British government, led by Prime Minister Robert Peel, decided to give Maynooth a permanent, substantial state endowment, essentially ongoing government funding.
Why would a Protestant government fund a Catholic seminary?
Peel didn't do this out of deep theological conviction. He did it for purely pragmatic political reasons. He was trying to pacify unrest in Ireland and build political goodwill with a Catholic majority.
But Noel, as a deeply committed Protestant evangelical, viewed Roman Catholic theology as fundamentally erroneous. So let's look at how he processes this. The moment state money is allocated to this seminary, Noel realizes something terrifying.
He sees the underlying principle.
To use a metaphor, he realizes that state funding is not neutral. It's like a municipal water system. The moment the state connects its financial pipes to a religious institution, the water is flowing.
Right.
And Noel thinks, The state is now pumping public money to irrigate and grow religious teachings that I believe are completely false.
Exactly. The state is actively funding error. But he doesn't stop there. He takes the next logical leap by looking at who is operating the water valves.
He looks at Parliament.
Yes. The decision to fund Maynooth wasn't made by a council of devout theologians fasting and praying over the scriptures. It was made by politicians, many of whom Noel viewed as deeply irreligious or morally compromised, playing partisan games.
So the water supply isn't just connected, it's contaminated at the source.
The politicians are the rust and the lead in the pipes. Noel realizes that the state apparatus is structurally, inherently incapable of discerning theological truth.
Because they're just playing politics.
They don't possess the spiritual capacity to decide what is true religion and what is false.
Which leads inevitably to the final devastating realization. If the state is fundamentally unqualified to discern true religion from false religion, then the state has absolutely no business establishing, governing, or funding any religion whatsoever.
The pipes should be completely disconnected.
This is the absolute core of the principle known as voluntarism.
Right. Yes. Voluntarism is the conviction that religion must be entirely voluntary, supported solely by the free will offerings and passions of its believers, existing completely separate from state control, state money, and state interference.
For a man in Noel's position, reaching this intellectual conclusion is a nightmare.
It is an existential crisis, because the inescapable conclusion of voluntarism, particularly for a man possessing Noel's intensely sensitive, almost agonizingly rigorous conscience, is this.
He can't stay.
Right. As long as he remains a paid, licensed, practicing minister within the Church of England, which is, by definition, a state-established church, he is personally, morally complicit in a foundational error.
He is taking state money.
He is operating under the authority of state-appointed bishops in a system that he has now logically deduced is unscriptural and corrupt.
The cognitive dissonance simply becomes too loud to bear. He can no longer justify staying inside the system as an internal reformer, trying to fix the plumbing from the inside.
Because the plumbing itself is the problem.
He captured this torment perfectly in his journal in late 1848, didn't he?
Yes, writing the agonizing realization that a man is responsible for the sins of a communion to which he belongs.
Wow. If you know the system is broken and contrary to Scripture, remaining inside it means you own a piece of that brokenness. You are endorsing it with your presence.
Exactly.
So the dam finally breaks. In November 1848, a year defined by violent revolutions sweeping across Europe, Noel drops his own revolution on London. He announces to his shocked, wealthy congregation at St. John's that he is seceding from the established church.
And the reaction from the establishment is swift, severe, and punitive.
What happens?
Bishop Blomfield summons Noel to a private, undoubtedly tense interview on November 28th. Bloomfield doesn't offer a graceful exit.
I imagine not.
He immediately slaps a gag order on Noel, banning him from preaching in any Anglican church beyond the following Sunday. He is institutionally silenced.
Wow.
So Noel steps into the pulpit at St. John's on December 3rd, preaches his final sermon, and walks out the door. He is out.
But he did not go quietly into the night. Upon his exit, he immediately unleashes a massive 600-plus page manuscript to the press. It's titled Essay on the Union of Church and State.
And this book was not just a niche theological treatise. It was a cultural earthquake.
How big was the impact?
The publishing phenomenon surrounding this book is hard to overstate. The historical sources note that the entire first edition sold out in a single day.
In one day for a 600-page theology book.
Yes. The secular press was actively comparing its astronomical sales and its cultural impact to Thomas Babington Macaulay's History of England, which was the defining mega bestseller of that Victorian era.
That's incredible.
You had nonconformist ministers and the dissenters who had been arguing against the state church for years, treating Noel's book like a triumphant manifesto. They were holding weeknight public readings of the essay to packed, standing room only crowds.
Because the book was a systematic, surgical dismantling of the entire philosophical and theological architecture that propped up the state church.
He took it all apart.
He specifically targeted the four primary arguments that the establishment used to defend its existence: custom, natural duty, expediency, and scripture. Let's debate these a bit, because these are the exact arguments institutions use to defend themselves today.
Let's do it.
Let's play devil's advocate. If I'm an Anglican bishop in 1848, my first defense is custom. I tell Noel, we have done it this way for centuries. The union of church and state is woven into the very fabric of English history. You cannot just discard hundreds of years of tradition.
Noel's counter to that was ruthlessly historical. He argued that simply because a practice is ancient does not make it holy.
Oh, good point.
He meticulously documented the history of the church, arguing that the moment Christianity became allied with the Roman state under Constantine, it began a long, slow descent into corruption, wealth hoarding, and spiritual apathy. He turned the argument of custom on its head, saying history actually proves that state alliance is fatal to genuine faith.
Okay, what about the argument of natural duty? This was a philosophical argument heavily pushed by a brilliant young politician at the time named William Gladstone.
Gladstone's argument, right?
The premise is that the state functions like a parent to its citizens. And just as a parent has a moral duty to educate their child in the true religion, the state has a moral duty to provide a true church for the nation.
To dismantle that, Noel weaponized his recent realization over the Maynooth question. He countered, how can the state possibly act as a spiritual parent when the state is managed by partisan politicians who often possess no personal religious character whatsoever?
Because a parent must know the truth to teach the truth.
Exactly. The state, governed by constantly shifting political majorities, has no mechanism for determining spiritual truth. Therefore, it is structurally unqualified to act as a moral tutor.
All right. The third defense. Expediency. This is the pragmatic argument. A conservative politician might say, look, regardless of the high theology, having a state church is practically useful. It maintains social order. It ensures there's a vicar in every rural village. It keeps the lower classes moral. It is politically expedient.
Noel despised this argument above all. He argued that testing spiritual principles purely by their pragmatic social results is a dangerous, distinctly English flaw.
Because it ignores the truth.
Right. He cataloged the immense damage done by this expediency, the promotion of worldly, unspiritual men to bishoprics simply because they were politically connected, the stifling of genuine revival, the alienation of the working classes. He argued that compromising truth for the sake of social control destroys the church's soul.
And then we reach his trump card, Scripture.
Yes. For an evangelical like Noel, if the Bible didn't authorize it, the debate was over. He relied heavily on Christ's explicit declaration to Pontius Pilate, "My kingdom is not of this world."
So he just looked for biblical precedent?
He argued that if you read the New Testament, you see clear principles for a gathered church composed only of voluntary believers, completely distinct from the civil government. He challenged the establishment to find a single verse authorizing the Roman emperor or the British Parliament to govern the church.
And they couldn't.
Well, they couldn't.
What is truly fascinating and deeply tragic for Noel is the paradoxical reaction to his departure. You would logically assume that a superstar of his magnitude leaving, armed with this devastating 600-page takedown, would inspire a mass exodus.
You'd think so.
The nonconformists were certainly waiting for other evangelical Anglicans to follow him out the door, but that is the exact opposite of what happened.
The reality of institutional psychology took over. His exit didn't inspire his peers. It terrified them.
It backfired.
Completely. Prominent evangelical Anglican voices, men like T.R. Burks, watched Noel walk away, saw the immense ammunition his book gave to the dissenters, and they panicked. Instead of allowing Noel's arguments to make them question the establishment, they closed ranks defensively.
They got more rigid.
They became much more stubbornly supportive of the state church out of a deeply ingrained fear that if the religious establishment fell, the entire social fabric of England would unravel into anarchy. Noel's secession, intended to liberate his brothers, actually hardened the very institutional walls he had spent his life trying to blur.
The psychological and social toll this took on Noel personally must have been devastating. By publishing that book and walking out, he torched a massive amount of accumulated social capital.
He lost almost everything.
His close friendship with Samuel Wilberforce was permanently shattered. He alienated his aristocratic family, who were deeply embarrassed by his radicalism. And, as we mentioned, he forfeited the ultimate prize of his profession. In fact, a younger contemporary of his, who held very similar reformist views but ultimately chose to stay quiet and remain inside the church, was rewarded with a bishopric shortly after.
It's a stark contrast.
Noel chose the wilderness. He gave up the safety, the warmth, and the power of the front door.
He did. And the most remarkable part of this transition is that when he walked out of St. John's, he had absolutely no idea where he was going. He had definitively left the Anglicans, but he hadn't yet joined anyone else.
He was a man without a spiritual home, adrift in a highly sectarian world.
Total isolated.
So he's burned his bridges with the Anglican establishment, but he knows he cannot survive spiritually on his own. He needs a theological anchor. And in a move that shocked everyone, he decides to rigorously reevaluate the one ritual he used to perform routinely on infants: baptism.
For months after his secession, Noel was exploring his options. He worshiped briefly with the Presbyterians. He attended meetings with the Congregationalists. But his intensely logical mind couldn't let go of the baptism issue.
Because he'd already rejected baptismal regeneration.
Right. Remember, he had already publicly rejected the Anglican doctrine. Having torn down the false premise, he now had to figure out what he actually believed was the true scriptural mandate for the ordinance.
And the methodology he uses to arrive at his conclusion is so uniquely stubborn and analytical. The historical record shows that in the summer of 1849, he effectively locks himself away for an intensive study period.
Just him and the books.
He reads the Bible, of course, but remarkably, he refuses to read books arguing against infant baptism. Instead, he intentionally reads only the strongest theological arguments for infant baptism.
He wanted to test the opposing view.
He wants to see if the opposing view can withstand his scriptural scrutiny. And his ultimate conclusion is that it completely collapses. He convinces himself that believers' baptism, the immersion of adults upon a credible, conscious profession of faith, is the only model authorized by the New Testament.
And the sheer optics of what happens next are astounding.
Paint the picture for us.
In August 1849, this former aristocratic Anglican priest, a man who had preached to the wealthiest cultural elite of London, quietly wades into the baptismal waters of the John Street Chapel, a dissenter congregation in London, and is fully immersed.
What visual?
It was an absolute sensation in the religious press. His public address explaining his theological rationale for the baptism was published as a tract and eagerly passed hand to hand across London. Shortly after this, he formally took over the pastorate of that very chapel, succeeding a man named J.H. Evans.
He has officially walked through Auden's back door. He is a Baptist. But here's where the story gets incredibly complex. And frankly, I have to push back on Noel's logic here because his stance seems almost impossibly contradictory.
It does seem that way at first glance.
The man has just detonated his entire life. He's sacrificed his career, his social standing, his oldest friendships, all over deep scriptural convictions regarding church-state relations and the specific ritual of believers' baptism. He joins a highly specific denomination whose entire brand, whose very name, is built around this specific ritual.
Right.
And then what does he do?
Well, he ascends to become the chairman of the Baptist Union in 1855. And in his inaugural high-profile address to the denomination, he essentially stands at the podium and tells them to downplay their Baptist identity.
It sounds like madness. He joins the club, becomes the president of the club, and then says, hey, everyone, I know we sacrifice a lot to be Baptist, but let's not make a big deal out of this whole baptism thing.
That's quite the paradox.
He actively warns the denomination not to exaggerate the value of their special tenets, like believers' baptism or their strict congregational independence. He explicitly tells them not to let these structural rules become a barrier to communion and partnership with other Christians.
He really did.
Practically speaking, how do you even justify joining a strict denomination if your first act as chairman is telling everyone those specific rules shouldn't be barriers?
It looks like an irreconcilable contradiction from the outside. But internally, within Noel's highly structured theological framework, it is perfectly consistent. To understand him, we have to grasp a very strict distinction he made between church polity and Christian fellowship.
Walk me through that distinction.
Noel believed that church polity, meaning the mechanical structure of how a local church is governed, how it handles membership, and how it administers sacraments, must be ordered strictly by his reading of Scripture.
So he had to follow the rules for his own church.
Therefore, because his intensive study convinced him that the New Testament commanded believers' baptism and voluntary gathered congregations, his conscience demanded that he obey that structural model. He had to become a Baptist to ensure his local church's plumbing was built correctly.
Okay, I track with that. And fellowship.
He believed with equal burning fervor that Christian fellowship, who you love, who you cooperate with in mission, who you recognize universally as a sibling in Christ, must be based solely on spiritual conversion, not on whether they got the structural polity right.
I think I see it. It's like saying, I have to build my own house according to these exact blueprints because I believe it's the right way to build, but I will not demand that you rebuild your house to match mine before I agree to help you put out a fire in the neighborhood.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it. Hence, his continued, deeply passionate, undenominational love. He was a Baptist by strict conviction of polity, but he remained a Catholic Christian in that broad, universal sense by conviction of fellowship. He vehemently refused to let his new denominational badge become a fortress wall.
It is a breathtakingly difficult tightrope to walk, maintaining deep, structural convictions without weaponizing them against outsiders. But he walks it, and he begins to wield immense transformative influence in his new sphere.
He certainly doesn't slow down.
This shifts us into a phase of his life where he is actively reshaping the empire. And I love this era because it introduces us to one of the most incredible, tangible figures of Victorian London, a man named Samuel Morton Peto.
Peto is a titan of the era. He was a wildly wealthy, visionary railway contractor and a deeply devout Baptist.
A real captain of industry.
Oh, absolutely. When you walk through London today and look at the physical skyline, you're often looking at Peto's work. His engineering and construction firm built Hungerford Market, the famous Reform Club, the Olympic Theatre, Nelson's Column in Trafalgar Square, massive sweeping sections of the Great Western Railway.
And the most ironic building of all, right?
Yes. Most ironically, given Noel's views on the state, Peto's firm laid the foundational stonework for the new Houses of Parliament.
The man literally laid the physical foundation of the British government's seat of power, and he and Noel become allies.
They do. Peto and Noel work closely together, most notably serving on the Baptist Metropolitan Building Society.
What was the goal of the society?
This was a massive initiative dedicated to financing and physically building new, prominent chapels across the rapidly expanding, desperately underserved neighborhoods of the city.
The contrast and the partnership between these two men is cinematic. You have Samuel Morton Peto leveraging immense industrial wealth, iron, and engineering genius to build the physical infrastructure of the British Empire.
And right beside him.
Right beside him, you have Baptist Wriothesley Noel, leveraging his aristocratic pedigree, his fierce intellect, and his oratorical power to build the moral, spiritual, and social infrastructure of that same empire.
Together, they elevated the nonconformist dissenting movement to an unprecedented level of respectability, visibility, and sheer civic power. These dissenters weren't just quietly slipping through the back door anymore. They were physically building the front door, and they were funding the estate.
And Noel utilized this new, powerful platform at John Street Chapel to continue his relentless social and political action. He never stopped looking at the streets.
He kept his focus on the destitute.
In January 1861, a massive interdenominational meeting was convened at Sussex Hall. Noel was brought in as the chief speaker. The explicit goal of this meeting was to strategize on how to reach the absolute lowest, most marginalized, destitute classes living in the squalor of the East End of London.
And this is a crucial historical dot to connect. Out of the passion and strategy of that Sussex Hall meeting grew a localized organization called the East London Special Services Committee.
And that specific committee,
formed and energized by the influence of men like Noel, directly evolved into the organization founded by a man named William Booth.
which became the Salvation Army.
Exactly.
The fundamental DNA of the Salvation Army. Its relentless, uncompromising focus on the poorest of the poor. Its highly pragmatic use of whatever means necessary to reach people. Its willingness to bypass traditional paralyzed church structures to bring the mission to the streets. That entire operational DNA has Baptist Wriothesley Noel's fingerprints pressed deeply into it.
His vision was constantly expanding outward. And he didn't restrict his moral vision to domestic poverty. One of the most significant, courageous political stands of his later life occurred on an international scale during the American Civil War.
This is a vital historical moment to report on impartially, as it shows his consistency. When the American Civil War broke out, the prevailing sentiment among British high society, the aristocrats, the wealthy industrialists, the conservative politicians, the exact circles Noel had been born into, heavily favored the Confederacy.
Why did they favor the South?
Britain's massive textile industry relied heavily on Southern cotton, and many British aristocrats felt a deep cultural kinship with the aristocratic, landowning culture of the Southern plantation owners. We're not endorsing that view, but historically, that's where the elite sentiment lay.
But Noel, driven by an absolute theological opposition to the institution of chattel slavery, took the exact opposite stance. He publicly stood with the London Emancipation Society.
This was in 1863, right?
Yes. In 1863, he took a seat on their General Committee, serving alongside major liberal intellectuals like the philosopher John Stuart Mill. Noel served as a chief speaker at massive, highly charged public meetings in Exeter Hall in London and the Free Trade Hall in Manchester. He was explicitly arguing for British support of the federal North and the abolition of slavery.
He didn't just speak, he organized. He chaired a major conference of British ministers and personally drafted a formal address. This document, which was eventually signed by over 4,000 British ministers, sent a powerful message of solidarity to the churches of the northern United States.
He used his influence on a massive scale.
Noel leveraged his immense moral capital to help sway British public opinion against the Confederacy at a critical historical juncture where British political or military intervention could have fundamentally altered the outcome of the war.
He was doing exactly what he had done in 1841 with the Corn Laws, applying his theological convictions to the most pressing, agonizing human crises of his day, regardless of the political cost or the sneering opinions of his aristocratic peers.
But despite these massive world-altering contributions, the cultural tide around Noel was shifting. And it wasn't shifting in the direction of his broad, loving vision. The cooperative Catholic Christianity of his youth, that era of open-source collaboration across denominational lines, was fading away.
The world was changing.
It was about to be replaced by a new, much sharper, aggressive era of religious tribalism.
Which brings us to the final, somewhat melancholic chapter of his public life, his eclipse by a new generation, epitomized by Charles Haddon Spurgeon.
To grasp this shift, we have to understand Spurgeon's immense gravity. If Noel was the refined, aristocratic, nuanced statesman of the Baptist denomination, Spurgeon was the undisputed rock star.
He was universally known as the Prince of Preachers.
He was a master of mass communication, pulling in crowds of thousands every week, and he was fiercely, proudly, unapologetically Calvinistic and Baptist. He dealt in certainties, not nuances.
In 1864, the religious world of London was rocked by a massive controversy initiated by Spurgeon. He preached a sermon that was a blistering, highly publicized attack on evangelical Anglican clergy.
What was the attack about?
He didn't just disagree with them, he essentially accused them of deep, systemic, intellectual, and spiritual dishonesty. He pointed out the old contradiction. Evangelical Anglicans privately denied the doctrine of baptismal regeneration, yet they stood at the font every Sunday and used the Book of Common Prayer, which contains that exact language.
Right.
Spurgeon publicly called them out, suggesting they were hypocritically signing off on doctrines they knew to be false, simply to keep their state salaries and their social standing.
Now let's look at this from Noel's perspective. Noel had agonized over this exact contradiction. It was the precise theological issue that drove him to sacrifice his career and leave the Church of England 16 years earlier. You would assume he would stand up, applaud, and shout, "Yes, give it to them, Charles. I told them the exact same thing in 1848.
But he doesn't join the attack. Instead, Noel rushes into print with a pamphlet defending his former Anglican colleagues against Spurgeon. He publicly criticizes Spurgeon's tone and his accusations of dishonesty.
I have to play the skeptic again here. Why on earth would Noel defend the honor of the institution he sacrificed everything to escape? Spurgeon was technically arguing Noel's own point.
Because for Noel, how you argued was just as important as what you argued. The manner of Spurgeon's critique violently violated Noel's lifelong commitment to the spirit of love and unity.
So he defended them out of principle.
Noel cited the established rules of the Evangelical Alliance, which demanded that Christians treat each other with grace and assume good faith, even in the midst of profound disagreement. Noel believed the Anglican ministers were theologically wrong, yes. He believed their logic was deeply flawed. But he also believed they were sincere in their rationalizations.
He wouldn't call them liars?
He flatly refused to call men he had known and loved liars or hypocrites. For Noel, preserving the bond of evangelical brotherhood was infinitely more important than scoring cheap, aggressive points in a public theological blood sport.
He is defending the developers of the open source code, even when those developers are stubbornly using an interface he fundamentally disagrees with. But how does the fiercely loyal Baptist world react to their chairman defending the Anglicans against their superstar preacher?
They essentially reject Noel. Spurgeon was absolutely furious. He wrote a bitter letter to an ally, William Landels, complaining that Noel talked endlessly of love and unity, but abandoned his own Baptist brothers when the fighting started.
Oh, wow. So it created a real rift.
The result of this controversy was a deep, unhealable fracture. Spurgeon, Landels, and a rising younger generation of Baptist men who had no memory of the golden age of cooperative Catholic Christianity effectively sidelined Noel. In 1865, they formed the London Baptist Association, consolidating their power.
And the tone of this new association is completely alien to Noel's vision. It is highly self-conscious. It is fiercely proud of its specific denominational borders. It is exclusive. They didn't want open windows. They wanted sharp, distinct walls.
Noel's era had definitively passed. He was relegated to the polite but powerless role of a senior statesman. He was respected for his past sacrifices, trotted out to sit in an honorary chair now and then, but he was fundamentally ignored when it came to the actual direction and spirit of the movement. The denomination fully embraced a rigid, aggressive tribalism.
We really need to analyze why that shift happened, because it feels so incredibly relevant to how movements function today. Why did Spurgeon's rigid, combative tribalism win out so decisively over Noel's nuanced, cooperative spirit?
It comes down to the brutal mechanics of mass movements and communication in a changing society. In the latter half of the 19th century, literacy was skyrocketing, the steam-powered printing press was churning out cheap, mass-market literature, and the religious marketplace was incredibly crowded and competitive.
So it was about branding.
Yes. In that high-volume environment, sharp, distinct, aggressive branding, which is exactly what Spurgeon delivered, is vastly easier to sell than nuanced, loving, complex cooperation. Spurgeon offered the masses an identity with crystal-clear borders. We possess the unvarnished truth. They are compromised. Here is the line in the sand.
It's just easier to rally around an enemy.
Exactly. Noel, on the other hand, asked people to do something incredibly difficult. He asked them to hold firm structural convictions while simultaneously extending grace and love to those who actively disagreed with them. Psychologically and sociologically, Spurgeon's binary approach is simply easier for a mass audience to digest and rally behind.
Noel dies in 1873, and the ultimate tragedy is that he is largely forgotten by the institutional historians of both sides for decades.
Because he didn't fit the narrative.
Right. The Anglicans wanted to quietly erase him because he was a high-profile seceder who humiliated the establishment. The Baptists wanted to ignore him because he wasn't tribal enough. He was a liability who was always trying to drag them back into uncomfortable partnerships with the people they were trying to fight.
He was a man without a tribe, rendered historically homeless, precisely because his vision of the church was simply too large and his love too broad to be confined by the walls of any single faction.
So as we pull back from the 19th century, what is the core takeaway for you listening to this deep dive today? The Life of Baptist Wriothesley Noel is a breathtaking masterclass in living out your deepest convictions without sacrificing your humanity and without losing your love for the people across the aisle.
He really is a model of conviction mixed with grace.
He looked objectively at the incredibly powerful system he was born into, identified its structural flaws, and willingly sacrificed unparalleled privilege, wealth, and aristocratic power for the sake of his conscience. He laid the intellectual, theological, and practical foundations for grassroots movement that physically saved thousands of lives in the slums of London, the city missions, the ragged schools, and the Salvation Army.
And perhaps his most enduring, challenging legacy is how he acted when he found a new home. When he sacrificed everything to walk through that back door into the Baptist denomination, he fiercely refused to let his new tribe devolve into an echo chamber.
He wouldn't let them close the doors.
He stood in front of his own people and constantly, uncomfortably reminded them that their shared faith with the outside world was vastly more important than the structural differences that gave them their identity.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought to mull over as we finish. We live in a modern landscape that is hyperpolarized. It is deeply, aggressively, often violently tribalized.
That's putting it mildly.
We live in an era where our communication infrastructure, social media algorithms, news networks is explicitly engineered to reward Spurgeon-style attacks. The system rewards sharp branding, calling out the hypocrites, and drawing rigid, unforgiving lines in the sand. Those same algorithms actively punish Noel-style bridge building, nuance, and any defense of the outgroup.
It's so true. The nuance gets buried.
In this kind of environment is the ideal of Catholic Christianity, that broad, open-source cooperation for the greater good. Is it still practically possible? Can you, in your own life today, hold deep, life-altering personal convictions about what is true and right without eventually vilifying, mocking, or excommunicating the people who see it differently.
It's the ultimate challenge.
Noel proved that it is possible to give up the power of the front door, walk humbly through the back door, and still insist on leaving all the windows open. The question remaining for us is, do we have the courage and the grace to do the same?